Current time is now 7:26 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. It's time for our Thursday's Made it Korea. And joining us in the studio is Professor John DeMoya from Seoul National University. Professor, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me.
Today, we've had a number of multi-series, history lessons.
Sure.
And today's one of them. And
yes,
I think
absolutely.
It's right.
And it very much deserves it.
Oh, absolutely. And, I've always stressed the importance of talking about, the good history, the positive history, but also the negative ones, too, the dark history.
More complicated ones, yeah.
And actually, now that I think about it, there's been more bad ones than good ones that we covered, which, hey, you have to go through all of that and then, learn from our past mistakes and create a better society and a better future.
And if I can really quickly interject just to give you that.
Go ahead.
When I teach Korean history to non-Koreans who are less familiar, I have to stop halfway through the semester and remind them that much of the 20th century for Korean history is fairly dark, and remind them that, this is Korean history. It's not like I'm, making this up.
And so today we're going to be talking about this. We are approaching actually this particular date, although it's we talk about April 3rd.
Yes.
A single date, but actually something that happened for a longer period. It's
yes,
just that a single
over
day.
A much more extended period of time, which we can talk about.
Oh, absolutely. And so in the early 1948, an incident in Jeju became one of the notorious events of the pre-Korean War period, though for a long time this event was suppressed from discussion.
Yes,
right?
You could not discuss it because following especially the Korean War and the U.S.-Korea relationship, it did not look good for the South Korean government as well as for the sort of alliance because of the violence that erupted.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about what we call the 4-3 incident or the April 3rd incident. And I want to stress the fact that it is now officially called the April 3rd incident.
I think that is the common vocabulary these days. Yes,
because there was some controversy in the ways that this particular event in history was described. Because before they used the word April 3rd uprising.
I have seen that in some documents, yes.
Yes, and so it wasn't an uprising, right? And it's very controversial if you call it an uprising. So we're calling it an incident right now, and that's what the government has also said.
Sure, and I've seen it in Korean as 4-3 sagon, which translates roughly the same.
Exactly. So starting things off here, we want to talk about, because this involves both the United States and South Korean government.
Yes.
Let's talk about how the U.S. sought to transition from Japanese rule after August 15, 1945.
Okay. So first of all, it helps to remember that the U.S. was not here. I think people forget that at the moment of Haebang celebration, the war is over, and the U.S. will not actually arrive here until, depending on the date you get, September 7th or 8th. So to give you the quick context to that means that Koreans have almost 3 weeks to prepare. There are what are called people's committees, Korean groups which have populist feelings designed to transition from that rule. When the U.S. arrives in September 45, roughly 3 weeks later, two things, of course. The Russians have already come down from the north to meet at the 38th parallel, and that's where you get the tentative beginnings of which we can later anticipate. But for this point, what will become in English, the United States Army Military Government in Korea, in Korean, Migunjung, they basically have the option very quickly, should we talk to these people's committees that are already being set up, and very quickly, and you can feel the meaning of the word people's committees in the mid-1940s, they're informed, don't do this. John Hodge, who is the head of USAMJK, says, I will not recognize these people. It's going to be the American military government. So the quick context I'm trying to make is almost immediately the U.S. kind of says, whatever is on the ground in terms of Koreans organizing, we're not going to talk to that group of people. We're here to occupy. We're going to kind of get things set up on our own and figure things out. And this alienates a large number of Koreans, even from the get-go, who are wondering, wait, we just finished 35 years of colonialism. We've been kind of free for 3 weeks. What's going on here? I mean, not to exaggerate a little bit, but they're at the very least, they're confused.
Oh, absolutely. And there was actually heavy involvement both from the Soviet Union and the United States. Remember, for our listeners out there, we had this, segment with our Professor Benjamin Engel in the past, where even before the Korean War, the two Koreas were separated by North Korea and South Korea because there was a discussion in place with Soviet Union and the United States. And all right, how are we going to do this?
This was meant to be a temporary arrangement,
Yes.
which turned into a long-term discussion, which turns into we are now here many years later still discussing this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So there was always this involvement both from the United States and the Soviet Union before the Korean War. And this is sort of
Sure.
the start of this. You mentioned the United States military government in Korea.
Sure.
Let's talk about what kind of problems it faced in administering Korea.
Yeah, sure. Lots. And let's be really concrete about it. Very few, in fact, probably almost no Americans speak Korean at the time, which is a huge problem. So what they end up doing, of course, is either recruiting Koreans who probably already worked for the Japanese colonial government, which is problematic, or bringing in maybe a few Japanese who actually, in many cases, in key positions like an engineer or a doctor, were asked to stay. So to give you the context again, Koreans are like, wait, like the occupation is over, it's the end of colonialism, the Japanese are going home, but this guy is staying who was my boss or who was a problematic person. So both the Koreans who the USMJK works with, the Japanese they asked to stay, immediately sends off the kind of wrong reverberations. And then last thing, which I think some Koreans might not know, the USMJK personnel do receive some training as early as 43, 44 for what's called civil administration. They're getting prepared for post-war occupations. However, because Korea was not on the Americans' minds, most of the people that are sent here with that training were trained specifically for Japan. So you get the idea really quickly that the Americans were kind of stumbling into the dark. It's sometimes called a government by translators. And then one last thing to finish it, and I like this even though it is kind of dark. John Dower, the former major historian of Japan at MIT, points out that Japan occupation gets sort of the New Deal liberals who kind of spill over, and actually that occupation turns out to be far more liberal and experimental, 45 through 52 in Japan. He says, unfortunately, by the way, the Koreans got the darker occupation that was originally planned for Japan, kind of a more military, more harsh rule.
Right.
And so, Mi Gun-jung did not have a lot of knowledge. They approached that by being harsher and more strict. And then Hodge famously, somewhere in the first couple of weeks, was asked about Koreans. I can't remember if this was a radio address or some public statement. And he said essentially, and this is really horrible, but I'll give you the softer version of it. He said, well, the Koreans were underneath the Japanese, so I regard them as the same breed of cat. In essence,
wow.
And he has been rightly criticized for this for years.
So, remember for our listeners out there, actually even before, we were talking about how now South Korea and Japan are, allies.
Certainly since the time of the Korean War.
But before that, when we're talking about this time, 1945, we've just been liberated from Japan. USA was fighting Japan, and so they were still technically enemies, which is why keeping soldiers in South Korea made sense to kind of keep Japan in check and all that stuff. Things are not so good. But what was the political climate in the South between late 1945 and the spring of 1948?
Sure.
What we're going to go into with the UN-sponsored elections coming.
Okay. Really broadly, it was enormously diverse. Famously, as people will know, by the time you get to almost 50, it's extremely polarized because North and South have declared independence in 48 and then are getting ready for what is the official beginning of the war. Or recognized as such. But 45 through 48, the estimates are that, first of all, we didn't know division was going to happen permanently. Second of all, there were estimates that there were more than 100 political parties spanning the entire spectrum, so far less polarized, far more diverse and complicated. And that means that particularly in the South, you can be obviously leaning more towards, to use the figures we know, Lee Sung-man and be a nationalist.
Right.
But you can equally be in the South and be a leftist / communist and still be nationalist, meaning you favor a united Korean peninsula or even a South Korean nation, but you certainly some of those communists might be pro-North, but a lot of them are not. It's extremely complicated all over the place.
So we're basically seeing the start of a conservative liberal kind of view in politics in some ways?
That divide will come, but again, that polarization only really takes shape over 47 and 48. Those first couple of years are very diverse. I can even, my own university, not the current campus in Quanok, but the older campus in now Tehanno, which was the Seoul Hospital now. That was the original campus. There are stories, easy. If you read the American military reports, they say, and I quote, the campus was in almost constant turmoil. Basically, student parties of all stripes were trying to claim the newly created Seoul National University as it's right wing, it's left wing, whatever it is, it represents our interests.
Well, because we see this, right? Because ultimately, nationalists in Lee Seung-man, right? He was also favored by the United States.
Yes, that is part of the reason he was brought in, and that's more complicated. But yes, absolutely. Right. And the fact that he had legitimacy in some eyes because of his connection to the provisional government.
And so we see that even now, because you would say that a conservative government would like to kind of work closer with the United States. And we see that with the current conservative Yoon administration, whereas if you look at some of the more liberal administration, like the previous Moon Jae-in administration, they've been pushing with striking dialogue with North Korea.
Okay, I see where you're going. Yes,
the
there are
whole
all kinds
idea
of
of
analogies.
unification, right? I like
sure,
this,
sure.
and things like that. We still kind of see that. But there was a ton of issues in governing Jeju, though.
Okay.
Of all places, Jeju.
Yeah.
Because, in some ways, probably one of the more isolated regions.
Exactly.
It's an island, and all this before 1948.
Sure.
Let's talk about this.
Okay. I don't know that once you hit 45, Jeju is any more politically diverse than much of the peninsula. But as you have rightly pointed out, the island nature makes it particularly complicated. And what will really happen, and leading up to, as we start to discuss the so-called 4-3 incident, is that people, in particular, I got to remember the name now. The Workers' Party South Korea, which is definitely left/communist. As you get to 47, 48, and you know that United Nations elections are coming up, they see this as, okay, this is going to create a split. This is probably going to end any opportunity to keep a unified Korean peninsula. So above all things, they're really opposed to that. Mm-hmm. And they will call for a general strike somewhere in the range of spring 48, February or March. This, of course, is not something that those on the Korean right are going to favor. And this is probably going to be the beginnings of setting up the terms of a confrontation.
What was kind of the reason why that there were kind of main reason for why they were against this? Now we simply put them as the leftist parties. What was their main, I guess, concern? I
think their main concern was that I have no idea how much they knew that Lee Seung-man would be elected, but certainly their concern was that they knew that the Soviet Union was discouraging North participation. They anticipated that this would create a further split, and that what was already a occupation of the Russians in the North and the Americans in the South, that these elections might cement that division, might create a more permanent rift, which in fact turned out to be the case.
It's true.
And so they were very much... I don't think it was specifically against a candidate so much as they saw the electoral process itself as leading down a potentially dangerous, divisive road.
But it's hard to say that they had communist ideas, right? It wasn't necessarily because
certainly not communist meaning pro-North Korean. No, exactly. Communist meaning nationalist. And also, many of these guys had very legitimate credentials against opposing Japanese colonialism for years, being on the left. So I'm using... The word communist might be misleading,
especially because that was actually one of the main reasons for why this whole the April 3rd incident happened in the first place, and we'll kind of get into this. Similarly, were there incidents or problems in other parts of Korea, and also do these events kind of provide any further understanding for what's going to happen in Jeju?
Absolutely. Yes, there are, particularly in a number of incidents over the course of 45 to 48, but particularly as you get to 47 and 48, eruptions of violence prior to this that will be now seen from a long-term historical perspective as perhaps the first beginnings of the Korean War, in the sense that you'll have local areas push back against It's not yet the Lee Sung-man government, whatever, but the transition to that. And to be honest, too, I mean, to give you the larger historical terms, too, it's probably why Kim Il-sung and North Koreans looking down south thought, wow, there are partisans down there who like us, because these people, as you said, may have been pushing back against the coming of an Lee Sung-man government. And they may have even proclaimed themselves to be left-oriented. That didn't necessarily mean pro-North Korean. But the North Koreans are looking at this saying, wait a minute, people are erupting in violence.
Right.
Wow, if we just go down there, we'll be welcomed with open arms, which turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, so the big thing here is that, I mean, we simply call them, those with kind of, leftist ideas, but they were just not a big fan of the idea that this...
They didn't want division. They didn't want an authoritarian, sort of more right-wing government.
Right. And so knowing that Lee Sung-man was very closely tied with the United States, and that any close ties with the United States will mean a further division of Korea.
Yeah, that's the best. I like that.
Yeah, instead of working to kind of unite to one Korea, this is why, I can understand why Kim Il-sung was going, hey, look at those guys.
Yeah.
It seems like...
I think he plausibly thought that, that must be people who will be sympathetic to us.
Yeah, and remember, no one's going on Twitter to tell them what's going on here.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes messages can be delivered in a wrong way. Let's talk about now start of our... really is a tragic incident here. Some people have even called this the April 3rd massacre.
Yes.
We say April 3rd, 1948, but again, I want to stress the fact that this has happened for a very, very long period of time.
Sure. And I can give you a rough parameters to that, or?
Yeah, let's talk about what happened on April 3rd.
Okay. On April 3rd, which then, as you pointed out, begins a much more extended period of violence, members of the Workers' Party South Korea will attack police officers who would represent... It's not yet formally South Korea as of August 48, but nonetheless, it's, the incoming South Korean government. And my understanding is, too, they attacked electoral workers because, again, they're attacking this institution of the May election coming up. They will, I'm sorry, there's also a paramilitary group called the Northwest Youth Alliance or Northwest Youth League, which is, again, like sort of Lee Sung-man supporters. These Worker Party South Korea guys will attack them. I understand a small number of police are killed. Some electoral workers are killed. But this will then turn into, from that point, that's officially the April 3rd, the more confined, from roughly April through roughly April or May of the next year, almost about a 13, 14-month period, there will be a prolonged battle / conflict / series of incidents, and where you use the word massacres, of course, is the government was going to respond by suppressing this with all kinds of force. And the numbers of people who are killed on the side of the people who initially pushed back at the police and the electoral workers, those estimates vary widely.
Absolutely.
From anywhere as on the low end of 10 to 15,000, on the high end I've seen 60, 80,000. It's one of the reasons why Jeju is still kind of a special place in the sense that people don't really want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that a lot of this activity took place in sort of caves and spaces near Halasan where you could hide out. And that is where the people who are against the government forces, so that you still have, I guess, occasionally, literally to even today, bodies and pockets of things being discovered.
So these the attacks, was conducted both by the U.S. government and the South Korean.
That's where it gets really interesting. I'll say this. There were very few, as to my understanding, there are a few American guys there, but it's more a question of not so much participation as they were there, they clearly knew what was going on, and how active or how passive were they in allowing the Lee Sung-man government to conduct this activity. So, I would put it in terms of less about men with guns and participation as how complicit are they, and did they sign off on this? And that's still very much debated.
Basically did they allow this to happen? Could they have easily stopped?
Exactly. Could they have intervened?
Yeah, stopped the Lee Sung-man government from doing this. But, again, we almost make it sound like as if, again, the Lee Sung-man government, what they did, and then what they did was, wrong. But you have to understand why I guess the conservatives or the right-wingers or the Isamang supporters are kind of favoring this idea, right? Whereas the leftist side are going, listen, we need to liberate, we've just been liberated. We need to put the Korea in one. This is going to create more division. We've already talked about that. Whereas the right wings, they're going, listen, we have been taken over by Japan for years. It was the United States who came, bombed Japan.
And has liberated us in some sense. Yeah.
And I'm sure with the power that they have and their presence with us is going to further push back any chances of any other kind of invasion or kind of colonialism.
And then I guess if we want to mean clear that we're following kind of like the right-wing logic, these are not communists/nationalists. These are communists. These are people who threaten our recent liberation, and they have clearly indicated that they are anti-government, which they are.
Right.
We have every right to suppress this by whatever means necessary to end this activity.
Yeah.
So this is where some historians, specifically Alan Millett, I think who's retired now, but he was at Ohio State, have called this one of the, in some ways, the unrecognized outbreak of the Korean War, and that you do have actual, real physical violence taking place deep in the southern part of the. Yeah, well, on an island, but off. Yeah.
For our listeners out there, you have to understand that shortly after Korea was liberated, there was again this big rift within Korea onto how to go about running this country.
Oh yeah, there was no, again, the political portfolio of the sheer number of parties. There were hundreds of parties competing for with different agendas.
And so what the communist supporters up in North were saying that is, listen, I mean, being that we're such a poor country, this whole idea of communism where everything is shared and fair and equal, it's only going to eliminate poverty. It's great. Whereas, those in the South are going, absolutely not. This is not the way to go. And so there was... like even amongst people, there were clashes.
And even to link to like the larger events taking place outside, the North traditionally has the guerrillas who are coming from Manchuria, so they have some legitimacy that they fought against Japanese colonialism. The Southern supporters are the ones who are more connected to the provisional government. We've been out there all along fighting for you since the 1920s. They both have their own claims to legitimacy during the colonial period.
Yeah, and so it even got to the point where I think some of the supporters of communism, we talk about Kim Do-hwan, who is a political gangster. He had a huge influence over Jongro, which is really the center of Seoul, the heart of
I've often heard him described as kind of a street politician, and not in a good way.
No, not in a good way.
Not literally battling in the streets.
But he actually sided with the communists in the beginning. He was attending rallies and he was making speeches.
I did not know that, but it's interesting. Okay.
Only because someone that his right-hand man, who started off as a homeless, did not like the idea of poverty and wanted to eliminate poverty, and he got Kim Do-hwan into this until later on. One of the nationalists came out of like some of the Lee Seung-man people saying, your dad, General Kim Ja-jin, he was actually killed by his own people, his own men, and he was a communist believer. And so that changed everything, and he started going anti.
No, if I can throw in, I think, to what you're talking about, but the way people changed their positions in this very fluid period. Remember that the DMZ, I'm sorry, not today, it's not the DMZ, it's the 38th parallel, is still theoretically open at this time. It's not like it is now completely barbed wire. So what you really have is a lot of Pyongyang was originally the center of Korean Christianity. A lot of those people are coming south. And smaller numbers, people going north, are scientists and artists who believe in that revolution. Yeah. So that's where the polarization starts to take place as people sort themselves out and start choosing north and south.
We've basically set the tone on why there is this division in Korea even before the Korean War has begun. We're going to talk more about the April 3rd incident in part 2 next week. Until then, Professor De Moya, thank you very much for coming in today, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you very much.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.